Welcome back. Let us continue with this unit, group communication. Till now we have discussed about verbal and non-verbal communication. Today I will talk about communication network. Within organizations, when we are working in a group or teams, then what kind of network people do follow, or they create that, establish that network to communicate with the other members of the group. So, social psychologists have talked about some different kind of communication networks based on the purpose of the task. The first kind of communication network is single strand or chain communication, which is the most traditional form of networking or communication network, where people try to convey or transfer information and knowledge from one person to another in a flow. So, when we are talking about communication network based on single strand or chain communication, on top is the leader. For example, in this diagram itself, leader A, the senior manager, will transfer the information to the other managers B, C and D, and in the whole process the information will flow from A to B, B to C and C to D. There can be no reversal in the flow and it will go from one person to another. So, this is a chain communication or a single strand communication. That means, under this communication pattern, the information flows from one person to the next person in the network, and leader A decides what information must be transferred from one person to another. That means, the leader will decide the quantity or the amount of information to be shared in what manner. The only drawback of this kind of communication network is that the communication process is linear and at the same time it is slow, because it will only go from one person to another. It can never be that A can approach C or C can approach D or B to understand or share the communication. So, this is a single strand or chain communication. The other is wheel network. In this kind of networking, there are spokes. The manager or the leader is central, peripheral, that is in this diagram. Leader A is the peripheral person or the central person, he is the main manager who is interacting with the other subordinates through the spokes, that A is interacting with B, A is interacting with C, A is interacting with D and A is interacting with E and vice versa. But the only drawback is that E, B, C and D, they cannot interact with each other. Their only communication is one spoke to the another. So, A can approach B single handedly or B can approach A, but there can be no communication among other members of the group. So, this is a wheel network, where in this network the information flows from the leader or manager to the end of each spoke and controls the lines of communication. So, the whole control lies with the A, control of communicating or sharing the information. B has no information about C, C has no information about D or vice versa, and D has no information with E. So, this is wheel network. That is how people tend to maintain or grasp that control on sharing of the information from one person to the another. But yes, the major aspect of this kind of networking is that according to leader, information is in circular motion. The information is flowing from one person to another because he has the control. So, this is the wheel network. The other is circular network. In this kind of communication, group exchange and builds a network of relationship and a sense of community, because people are interacting with each other. A, B, C, D, E, F, all are interacting with each other. There is a sense of community because there is connectedness, at least with A and B. C is there, but C is also interacting with A and C is also interacting with B. So, this is how the sense of community is existing in that networking. So, through practices of active listening, intentional speaking and conscious self monitoring, circle communication emphasizes individual contribution while building consensus to fulfill the purpose of the group. So, in this network, information is shared equally with the adjoining members. So, every member is aware of each other, that who is carrying how much information. The quantity and quality of information is maintained and is known to each other, not only the leader but the other members of the group. So, this is circular network. The other is Y network communication. In this type of communication, transfer of information to B and C and D can be done by A. That means A is the leader, A is communicating with C and A is communicating with D and A is also communicating with B. But the drawback is that C and D cannot communicate with each other and B cannot communicate with C and D. The idea is that A is controlling the information from all the directions. So, in this network, the leader can easily communicate with both superiors and subordinates, although the isolated members C, D and B can communicate with only A. That means A is communicating with this with superior ordinate, superordinate also, and A is also communicating with subordinate as well. His approach is diverse, but at the same time in this type of network communication, the approach of the other members fails to become diverse because A has the control. So, the flow of information is going in one direction or in one form only, that is the Y network. So, in Y network only this kind of information can be flown from one point to another. This is Y network communication. And the other is all channel network. This is the most profitable, advantageous channel of communication where members have opportunity to share information with each and every member in a very open manner and tend to foster self-managed teams, because interaction is with the other members. People try to establish a rapport, a sense of community with each member, and they try to accomplish the task all together in different forms. So, in all channel network, communications flow upward, downward and laterally among all members. That means the information is flowing in a very free manner, upward, downward, lateral and diagonal as well. And members follow a pattern of communication and supports an egalitarian, that means equal and unrestricted participative culture and fosters cross-functional efforts. Such a network is available in the case of informal groups. That means within organization, if we have some formal networking as well in form of single strand or chain communication, wheel network, circular network, Y network communication, then in all channel network, all these disadvantages of other networking can be overcome if there is a pattern of all channel network within organization, where there is equality, where there is unrestricted flow of information and every member is free to approach and interact with the other members, establish their own self-managed teams and accomplish the common goals. So, this is communication network. It is not only about that how information will be flown, it is actually that in what manner and in what quantity and what quality of information can be maintained in any pattern of communication. When we are talking about pattern of communication, then we have to also talk about direction of communication. That means there can be two forms of communication in organizations within the group, formal and informal. If we talk about formal information communication, then different kind of communication network do exist, like single strand, wheel network, Y network or circular network. And at the same time, if communication is informal, then it can be a free flow or all network communication. So, let us discuss about direction of communication based on two types of communication. The formal communication, this is an official way to share information and knowledge at the workplace with the colleagues in a very officious manner. That means the information will flow in a very formal fashion, that the information or any knowledge will be shared from higher authority and will be spread to the other aspects or departments of the organization in a very authoritative manner. There has to be an official channel through which that information will be shared to each and every member of the organization. So, it is dictated by the established hierarchical organization of the business. That means right from top to the bottom, the information is flowing from one hierarchy to the other. There is a formalized channel that how information will flow in a very appropriate manner. Now, this is very important to understand that since information is important, then how information will go through from one person to another or one employee to another, so that the sanctity of the information should be maintained. The information should not get maligned. Otherwise, when we are in any informal group, then the information, the structure of the information can be destroyed. So, this is an important aspect, that when we are talking about formal communication, it is important so that the sanctity of the information is maintained. So, it can be defined as sharing information regarding organizational activities through a proper channel. It can be related to any task, it can be related to any policies and procedures that have been established for the betterment of the employees, and it can be conveyed through reports, post descriptions, work commands, or information related to sales and inventory. So, the superior and the subordinate conversation comes under formal communication. Formal communication is used by group leaders and managers to assign goals, provide instructions, formulate and communicate policies and procedures, and offer feedback to employees. If that feedback becomes informal, then that feedback mechanism also fails. But if feedback is given in a very formalized fashion, then that professionalism of the feedback mechanism is being maintained, and employees get a strong message that at what point they have to enhance their performance. So, this is formal communication. Now, when we are talking about formal communication, then comes that how this formal communication actually exists in different forms. That means, either information will be communicated from top to bottom, or the information will go from bottom to top. That means, from higher authority to the subordinates, or from subordinates to the higher authority. It all depends that what kind of information is being communicated to other people in the organization. So, based on formal communication, there are three types of directions of communication: upward, downward, and horizontal or lateral communication. So, if I talk about upward communication, it is like from subordinates to superiors. That means, the information will flow from lower level of employees to the higher authorities. If it is about downward communication, then the information will flow from the superiors to the subordinates. That means, from the higher authority to the lower level. And if it is about horizontal or lateral communication, this kind of communication takes place among peers of the same or different departments. That means, people coming from different sections of the department are communicating knowledge or information from all the directions. So, let us first discuss about upward communication. In this kind of communication, the information is transmitted from a lower to a higher level, that is from subordinates to superiors. For example, grievances or any complaint regarding the union or employee union or salary, then under such kind of circumstances, upward communication becomes very advantageous. So, this kind of communication boosts the morale of the employees, because they are being heard by the higher authorities, and it is most of the time feature of any democratic setup or environment, where people have all the rights to speak, to voice their opinion, and they are free to convey their own discomforts and grievances to the higher authority. So, all these forms of communication comes in form of downward communication, where information is going up, it is flowing up from lower level to higher levels. And the other is downward communication. It is a kind of communication, the information is transferred from the higher to the lower level, that is from superiors to subordinates, and it is suitably found in an authoritarian environment. That means, where the environment is very much controlled by the higher authorities of the organization, people have less chance to approach the higher authorities, rather the higher authority will impose much instructions on the lower level of employees. So, this is downward communication. Now, this downward communication will most of the time comes in forms of instructions or commands or task orientation. And the last is horizontal or lateral communication. This kind of communication takes place among peers of the same or different departments. That means that how a finance manager is interacting with the other manager of the sales marketing in order to launch the new product, and what kind of money or finances are involved in launching or advertising a new product. So, here two departments are involved, finance and the marketing department or the sales and marketing department. So, this is horizontal or lateral communication, that people are interacting or employees or managers are interacting with each other from all the sections of the organizations or departments of the organizations. So, this is formal communication or directions of communication, informal communication based on upward, downward and horizontal or lateral communication. So, we can say that communication can be described in terms of four characteristics. That means, whenever we are understanding the process of communication, it has four features. The first is the density of communication, that means how much amount and quantity of communication has been processed among members. So, this quantity, if it is large quantity of communication, then how it has to flow. For instance, if it is very secret information that has to be shared with the other members, then definitely that communication or quantity of communication has to be shared through formalized manner. That means, formal communication will play a major role or will be advantageous to maintain that quantity of communication. The other is the distance between the members, that means how far the message must travel through the network to reach the receiver. Again, the higher authority can decide that one particular information or communication should travel to how many people in the organization, whether it is required to be shared with all the members or all the sections or departments of the organization, or it has to be shared with only specific departments of the organization. So, this is the distance between the members, that means who is sharing the information and who will decide that where the information will be sent and restricted to which type of people. The other is the path or channels to communicate with others, that means how the information will flow from one person to another. Now, under this kind of situation, different kind of communication networking plays a major role. It has to be wheeled, it can be single chain or strand, or it can be wide network. There the exact role of communication network comes in the picture, that how that channel has to be decided, that how the information will flow and where it has to stop and reach, and who will receive the information. And the last is the centrality of the position of members. Again, communication networking role play comes here again at this point, that to what extent is the member or central or peripheral to the group. Members who are central to the position are more committed to the work than those in less central position. That means, for example, here the wide network pattern will play a very important role, that how that in that Y pattern, A as a leader is the main person and he will decide that how the information will reach to the other person in what manner. So, these are the characteristics of communication that will decide whether the information to be shared should be through formal communication, informal communication, or what kind of pattern should be followed to share or communicate a message. So, this is all about formal communication. Next is informal communication. If some patterns are mandatory to share, to use those patterns or execute those patterns to share that information among group members, then another channel also can be informal communication, where the base is completely unofficial of sharing information and people tend to believe the information to be true, because they are very much related to an individual's psychological needs and desires. So, if we talk about informal communication, this form of communication is unofficial in nature and is based on the informal social relationships that are formed in workplace outside the hierarchicals or business structure. That means, here when we are talking about informal communication, then actually people will form an informal group who are coming from different departments and from different authoritarian positions, and still they are informal and sharing their own opinions, ideas and beliefs in a very informal and free fashion. So, this is the nature of informal communication. Such communication is the result of the natural desire to communicate with each other freely and frequently, such as grapevine. Why grapevine? Like grapevine has a tendency to stretch its branches to any direction. So, that is why informal communication has been exemplified with a grapevine. So, grapevine is an informal channel of business communication. It is called so because it stretches throughout the organization in all directions, because it is an informal group. People or group members are coming from all the different departments and centers to communicate or interact informally, and they also share the information in a very informal manner. So, this is how it stretches throughout the organization in all directions irrespective of the authority levels. Now, in this kind of communication pattern, even the highest authority, maybe the CEO, can also join any informal group, irrespective that CEO is also interacting with the middle level manager. So, informal communication has its own advantages as well, that means and disadvantages at the same time. First of all, that it is not controlled by the management, it is formed in a very natural manner. There are no rules and regulations, there are no policies and procedures which exist to dictate that how informal communication will initiate in any group. It actually starts or initiates in a very natural fashion. It is perceived by most employees as more reliable than the formal communique issued by the top management, because it is coming from different sectors of people to any one person. The person considers such type of information or communication to be highly reliable and has a strong belief that whatever communication he has received is true to his knowledge. The information is communicated only to those whom or she trusts. That means, when people are interacting informally, while people coming from different kind of departments and centers, then people will prefer to share any specific information with only specific person in that informal group, because trust exists in such type of communication. A trusts B in that communication, and he or she will share the information with B, and B will share maybe with another member because B trusts another person. So, this is how informal communication exists in any organization. It also serves the self interest of the people, that sometimes some unconscious desires or repressed desires also come up to the surface while interacting with the members in a very informal fashion, and they are opening up their own heart that this is what they desire or wish. So, they are also trying to meet their self interest in the process of informal communication. It is also helpful in achieving better human relations. Obviously, when sharing is informal, when there is no barrier, then people tend to establish better human relationships rather than being informal communication. It fulfills the psychological needs of the employees. That means that people tend to satisfy their sense of belongingness, they tend to relate more with the organization based on informal communication. It helps in identifying the issues that create anxiety among members. It therefore acts as a filter and feedback mechanism. Sometimes any employee who has heard about some anxious news about his organization will try to settle down his curiosity and anxiety while sharing the same information with his informal colleagues or friends, and will try to find out the truth, that to what extent that information that has been received by him is true or not. In that way, he tries to settle down the anxiety of himself and herself based on filter and feedback mechanism. And it is particularly valuable for translating formal communication in the group's own jargon. Sometimes people develop their own informal vocabulary or language, and they try to understand formal communication in their own way. They have their own perception to understand the whole system, and then they try to grasp or delve deal with the whole system in a very different manner. So, informal communication plays a very important role when we are talking about policies and procedures and the system of the organization. Next comes rumors. Now, when we are talking about informal communication, then grapevine is the metaphor that has been used to define informal communication, but how informal communication exists in any organization. This can be experienced based on rumors. Rumors are the only way through which informal communication takes place. It is derived from the Latin word rumorum, which means noise. That means that telling or giving explanations and stories about a particular information, and it has been circulated among members from one person to another related to any object or event or issue in public concern. That means people tend to interpret a particular information in different manner, and when they tend to share their imagination to different kind of peoples in very informal manner, then that becomes a rumor. That means it races like wildfire, that information or interpretation of the information races like wildfire, and people are caught in that ambiguous situation. Sometimes it is true, sometimes the information is not true, it becomes ambiguous in nature. That means it becomes absolutely meaningless in nature, and still people tend to believe that it is true. So, rumors are a recurrent form of communication through which people are caught together in an ambiguous situation and an attempt to construct a meaningful interpretation by pooling their intellectual resources. No matter what, that information is wrong, but when people tend to hear such rumors, they tend to consider it as true, and they try to relate it with their own intellectual knowledge, that to what extent the information can be true. So, this is rumor. That means rumors race like fire, they have no base, rather they are more ambiguous in nature. But at the same time, rumors are baseless and unverifiable. There is no base that from where this information is coming. It is only coming from one person to another. There is no specific source that from where that information is flowing. It is just that we are just encountering some kind of ambiguous situation or information, and we cannot verify it, since there is no source, a particular source that from where that information is coming, we cannot verify, and it is not on papers. It is simply informal and verbal in nature. It is an imagination. So, there is no verifiable document which can say that any rumor or information is true to its best. The other is that rumors are based on overactive imagination and race like wildfire because the information is interesting and at the same time ambiguous. People know that information is not true, but since it is very interesting, people tend to relate their own desires with that untrue information as well, and they try to believe it. So, these are rumors. And the other is that rumors consist of inaccurate messages and become taken as fact. That means it must be true because everyone knows it. Since it is flowing informally from one person to another, no matter it is ambiguous in nature, still people tend to consider that information to be true because everyone is speaking about it. Everyone is discussing about it, everyone is communicating the same information again and again with every person, then it actually becomes true by its nature. Next comes types of rumors. Rumors can be of various forms. So, in organizations, 4 types of rumors exist. The first is pipe dreams, bogey dreams, third wedge dreams, and the fourth is home stretchers. These are the types of rumors which we can relate with us very easily and are very much related to an individual's complete psychology. What they want to hear the same. They will say only what they want to see in the last, or they will do to the other person what they want to do, and how they try to do it in a very different form through informal communication, that is rumors. So, let us talk about pipe dreams as one of the major form of rumor. These rumors reflect public desires and wishes for outcomes are known as pipe dreams. That means what generally people want to happen, they also start talking about those wishes in a very imaginative manner, and they try to speak up about their dreams to every person, and that becomes a rumor ultimately. For example, this year bonus will be double for the employees. Now, it can be the situation that the information is completely wrong, it will lead to disappointment, but because every employee wants the Diwali bonus to be very hefty and double this time, so everybody will try to believe it. They will try to relate their own wishes with that rumor, and finally it leads to disappointment. But such kind of rumors express an individual's or reflect an individual and group members' desires and wishes that should come true to them. So, these are known as pipe dreams. The other is bogey dreams. These are the dreams which are based on fears and anxieties. Such rumors are likely to arise under conditions in which people are uneasy about things. For example, during the time of recession, since recession is existing in the market, then sometimes employees have this anxiety that maybe this time I will be fired by the organization. As soon as this fear is being expressed by one employee, maybe the other employee will also relate himself with the same kind of information, that too baseless, and it lead to bogey dreams. That means it is expanding, it is racing like wildfire, and it is leading to anxiety and discomfort among members. The other is wedge drivers. As the term implies, wedge drivers, that when we want to tarnish the image of the other person, we try to speak ill or we try to malign the image of the other person by speaking ill about that person. We will try to spread rumors about that person, and we will ultimately harm, or it is a form of verbal attack to the other person. So, wedge drivers are the rumors in which people intentionally give malicious statements about someone with the intent of damaging an individual's reputation. So, wedge drivers are a form of verbal attack. So, wedge drivers are very common in the workplaces because of competition, stiff competition, cutthroat competition. People tend to pull their colleagues back so that they can move ahead, and this is the best way in form of wedge drivers to give malicious statements about their colleagues and spread rumors about the person. And the last is home stretchers, that is, rumors are designed to reduce the degree of ambiguity in a situation by telling a story about something before it happens. For example, any merger and acquisition that has to take place in the organization, then people tend to create their own imagination or opinion that what will happen after this merger and acquisition, and this creates a kind of anxiety and sensation among group members. So, these are home stretchers, that they try to structure their own stories, that what will happen, what is going to happen, and how we are going to deal with that event. No matter what, that the higher authorities are still in the process to decide whether that merger and acquisition will happen or not, but other employees will construct their own stories about the merger and acquisition, and how they will react to it will also be constructed along with the same lines. So, these are home stretchers. So, there are 4 types of rumors: pipe dreams, bogey dreams, wedge drivers and home stretchers. All these kind of rumors or informal communication do exist at workplace within the group, and how people tend to communicate wrong information while considering it to be true, because they tend to relate their own wishes, own outcomes to those information. So, this is a form of informal communication. Next comes, which is a very important part of communication, is barriers to effective communication. Till now what we discussed is that how we communicate verbally, non-verbally, through rumors, through body language, use of time, use of space, use of touch, use of communication networks through single strand, wheel, circular, Y network or all channel network, and upward, downward and horizontal. We could understand that in fact we can weave a strong plan that how information can be flown from through a proper channel. But there can be several reasons that sometimes the communication becomes ineffective, and there are certain reasons that why communication becomes ineffective. The first is the semantic barriers, the other is psychological barriers, and the other is organizational barriers. Now, these three categories will help us to understand that at one point of communication, some or the other form of communication blocks will exist and how it impacts interpretation of information. So, if we talk about semantic barriers, as the term implies, it is about how we interpret the correct meaning or the incorrect meaning of the message in the communication process. So, there is always a possibility of misunderstanding the feelings of the sender of the message or getting the wrong meaning of it. The receiver explains the words, signs and figures used in the communication in the light of his experience, but creates doubtful situations. It is not that the intention of the sender is wrong, but sometimes because of having incomplete knowledge about any issue or not keeping up with the other work, task or flow in the workplace, then it leads to semantic barriers. Now, these barriers can be badly expressed message. For example, if the sender has not used sophisticated language in communication, then the interpretation can go wrong. It can be invalidated language, it can be the wrong use of words which can lead to wrong interpretation of the messages, and or the wrong choice of words where the sequence can also gets irregular, which can create a kind of confusion, because if the information is not constructed properly, then it can lead to some kind of chaos or confusion in interpreting the message. So, these kind of factors can lead to semantic barriers, and these kind of barriers are termed as linguistic chaos, as the language is not simple in nature. That is why it is being said that whenever we make any communication, it has to be unambiguous in nature. That means the language should be very simple and straightforward, so that the interpretation should go correct in every sense. It can be faulty translation, that means that sometimes due to lack of understanding of the whole phenomena, maybe the subordinates fail to understand the message that lies in the communication, and the translation becomes faulty or inaccurate. So, this is another reason that why semantic barriers exist in the process of communication. The other is technical jargon. Sometimes the departments use their own language to communicate, and some people fail to understand those jargons, which makes the communication very much ambiguous in nature. That means very complicated and less meaningful in nature. This creates a kind of complexity in the communication because of technical jargon. So, the communication is not simple, and sometimes employees fail to understand that communication and the interpretation goes wrong. And the other is body language and gesture coding. Sometimes the body language is wrong, or maybe how the person is reacting to the information through the body language, the message goes wrong to the other person, and this makes the whole process faulty and ineffective in nature. For example, non-verbal communication creates misunderstanding and hinders the proper understanding of the message. For example, yes or no. Maybe the information is that we will not execute a plan in this manner. Maybe the other person would say okay. That okay through non-verbal communication can go wrong to the other person. So, these are the barriers which leads to ineffective communication. That means certain factors where the meaning becomes less important to the sender and receiver, and the translation or the interpretation of the meaning becomes absolutely invalidating. These are the examples of technical jargons that are being used at workplaces, and when any new employee joins the organization, he finds lot of difficulty to understand those jargons and the communication goes wrong. For example, bang for the buck, a term that means to get the most for your money. Due diligence, putting effort into research before making a business decision. Sweat equity, getting a stake in the business instead of pay. The 9 to 5, business jargon meaning a standard work day. Chief cook and bottle washer, that I am the person who holds many responsibilities. Other internet jargons that do exist these days, since we are in an era of intense digitization while communicating or chatting with the officials. It is already there on the screen. By the way, BTW, see you around, see ya. FAQ, frequently asked questions, HTH, hope this helps. So, these are the examples that sometimes any new employee would join the organization and he fails to understand these jargons and the communication and the process of communication goes wrong. The other is psychological barriers. That means the receiver of the information tries to dig out the meaning without thinking much about the information and the interpretation goes wrong. This type of evaluation hinders the exchange of information and the enthusiasm of the sender gets dampened. We are sending the information to the receiver and in what psychological status the sender, the receiver is receiving the message, that is the psychological barrier. Maybe there is loss of attention, there is loss of retention and transmission of knowledge and there is distrust. For example, if I say that when the receiver is preoccupied with some other important task, the information that is being received is half-heartedly. Under such circumstances, when complete attention is not given to the information, the interpretation also goes wrong and at the same time the sender also loses that enthusiasm that what and how we are going to work on a particular project. The other is loss of transmission and poor retention. Even the information has been sent, sometimes because of loss of interest and not able to keep that information intact to oneself, then also it leads to distortion of communication pattern. So, when a person receives a message after it has passed through many people, generally it also loses some truth. That is what I said just now, that when we are engaged in informal communication, then sometimes what happens, the basic essence of the information is loosened. It is dampened, it is loosened. Then how to keep that sanctity intact under such circumstances, formal communication plays a major role. If not, then again psychological barriers exist and the communication becomes ineffective. This is called loss of transmission. That means neither the information that has been received is true and at the same time the information has not been kept intact by the receiver at the same time. So, this leads that every next transfer of information, the actual form or truth of the information is altered. And the last is distrust, that there has to exist a strong trust between the sender and the receiver. The more the trust exists between two people, then the more meaningful derivation will exist out of that information and the communication becomes complete and effective in nature, else the information communication becomes meaningless. And the last is organizational barriers. These barriers predominantly affect the capability of the employees as far as communication is concerned. That means what hindrances exist, for example, complexity in organizational structure. If the if the communication network is very complicated, then it becomes difficult for the sender to send information to all the concerned persons in a very effective manner. So, if the complexity of the structure is very complicated, that means lot of hierarchical structures does exist, then the information shared with at every level becomes very complex and that distorts communication process. That means from top to bottom or bottom to top, how the information is flowing in a very smooth manner or not, that will define whether the information flow is complex or it is smooth. For example, the formal division acts as a barrier in communication, especially when the communication moves from bottom to the top. For example, when a lower level employee has to send the message to a superior at the top level, there is a lurking fear in his mind that the communication may be faulty. They themselves assume that how they will reach the top level for communicating their grievances. The other is unwillingness to communicate. That means the subordinates do not want to send information to their superiors because it will be perceived negatively and adversely. So, with this imagination, sometimes the communication becomes ineffective because the lower level employees are unwilling to communicate in a very appropriate manner. It becomes imperative to send the information, it is shared in a modified or amended form. Thus, the subordinates, by not clarifying the facts, become hindrance to communication. And the last is lack of proper incentive. That means lack of incentive to the subordinate creates a hindrance to communication. The lack of incentive to the subordinate is because their suggestions or ideas are not given any importance. If communication is encouraged at both the ends, that is to the higher and to the lower or vice versa, then it is an incentive to the subordinates to communicate what exists in their mind, how they can put up with their ideas and opinions, and how it can be respected. The more the communication is respected by the higher authorities, the more the communication becomes effective in nature. So, that means the idea is when we are talking about barriers to effective communication, it can be overcome only when the higher and lower level authorities at the same time have the idea to respect the communication process from both the ends, so that the execution of the ideas is very smooth and successful. So, these are the barriers to effective communication, and how managers or higher authorities tend to make efforts to resolve these or eradicate these barriers to make the communication process more effective and smooth. So, we are through with this module of group communication. We will start with the next module in the next class. Thank you so much.